Picture this. It's October 29th, 1929. Thousands of men in dark suits crowd the steps of the New York Stock Exchange. Their faces are pale, their hands trembling, their eyes fixed on the doors as if salvation might walk out at any second. Inside, the air is thick with smoke, sweat, and panic. Papers fly like snowflakes as desperate traders shout over one another, their voices cracking under the weight of fear. Ticker tapes roll faster than they can be read, spitting out numbers that mean only one thing. Everything is collapsing. In just hours, billions of dollars have vanished. Lifetimes of savings are gone in seconds. Men who woke up rich that morning go to bed bankrupt by nightfall. And the cruelest part? For many, this was only the beginning. Because Black Tuesday wasn't just a stock market crash. It was the spark that set off a decade of darkness, poverty, and despair known as the Great Depression. But here is what most people don't realize. The disaster didn't come out of nowhere. For nearly a decade, America had been living in a dream, the Roaring Twenties, a time of wild parties, easy money, and unstoppable confidence. Everyone thought the future would only get brighter. People borrowed money they didn't have, bought stocks they didn't understand, and trusted bankers who promised the good times would never end. It was a fantasy built on greed, credit, and illusion. And like every illusion, it was destined to collapse. Yet within this tragedy lies another story, one far darker. Because while ordinary Americans lost their homes, their jobs, and their hope, the richest men on Wall Street played by a different set of rules. Some not only survived the crash, they used it to grow even richer. This is the untold story of Black Tuesday, the chaos, the broken dreams, and the ruthless power plays that turned Wall Street into ground zero of the greatest economic disaster in modern history. Stay with me until the end, because once you see how it all unfolded, you'll never look at money, power, or Wall Street the same way again. Step into New York City in the mid-1920s. Can you feel it? The air just hums with this electric energy, the kind of restless optimism that maybe only comes once in a century. The sidewalks are a river of people, men in sharp suits, women in sparkling sequined dresses, their laughter spilling out into the night as jazz music pours from smoke-filled clubs. Neon signs are buzzing above Times Square, Model T cars are honking their horns along bustling streets, and everywhere you look, America feels absolutely unstoppable. The Great War was over, the economy was booming, and for millions of Americans, the future looked brighter than ever before. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and it honestly seemed like that roar would never quiet down. But beneath that glamorous surface, behind all the champagne, the Charleston dance, and the skyscrapers piercing the sky, something dangerous was growing. Something that almost no one wanted to see. America wasn't just celebrating its prosperity, it was gambling with its very soul. In those years, consumer culture just exploded like never before. Radios became the new hearth of every home, connecting families not just to entertainment, but to news, sports, and the wider world. Automobiles, which were once a luxury for the rich, now rolled down the streets of small towns all across America. Henry Ford's assembly line made cars affordable, and suddenly, mobility wasn't just for the elite. It belonged to the middle class. Department stores sparkled with all sorts of new goods, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators, all promising to save time and completely redefine modern living. People bought and bought and bought some more, because everyone believed that tomorrow would be even richer than today. And the engine fueling that belief? Wall Street. The stock market wasn't just a playground for the rich anymore. Bankers and brokers made it incredibly easy for everyday Americans to get in on the action. Housewives, farmers, school teachers, factory workers, people who had never even thought about investments before, were suddenly pouring their life savings into stocks. To them, it felt like a golden ticket, a shortcut to the new American dream. Why work hard and save your money slowly, they thought, when you could invest and get rich overnight? But here's the catch, the really dangerous part. Most of this investing wasn't with money people actually had. It was borrowed. This practice was called buying on margin, and it was simple but incredibly risky. You could put down just 10% of the cost of a stock, and a bank or broker would lend you the rest. If the stock went up, you'd pay back the loan and pocket a nice profit. But if it went down, you'd owe far more money than you could ever possibly afford to pay back. To millions of Americans, though, that risk barely seemed real. The market had only gone up, up, and up. Newspapers hailed it as the dawn of a new era of prosperity. Columnists, bankers, even politicians promised that the good times would last forever. The mood was intoxicating, and intoxicants are always most dangerous when you stop realizing you're drunk. Picture a small-town family in Ohio. The father works at a factory, the mother keeps the home. They've never been wealthy, but in the 1920s they scraped together their savings and, just like their neighbors, they put it into stocks. Maybe it's General Motors, maybe it's U.S. Steel, names they trust, names that everyone says are sure things. They even borrow on margin because why not? If everyone else is getting rich, they don't want to be the ones left behind. Now multiply that one family by millions, and you start to understand the fever that was gripping the entire country. This wasn't just Wall Street's game anymore, it was the nation's. The great irony here, the prosperity wasn't being shared equally at all. While cities sparkled, farmers in the countryside were struggling with falling crop prices. African Americans and immigrants often saw very little of this new wealth. Workers in rural areas were being left behind. But in the grand illusion of the Roaring Twenties, those cracks in the foundation were easy to ignore. The glitter of New York skyscrapers and Hollywood movies just drowned out the quieter stories of hardship. And then there was the media. Newspapers blared headlines. Stocks soar to new heights. A bull market with no end in sight. Optimism sold papers, and that optimism fed the frenzy. Radio programs echoed the exact same tune. Politicians bragged about the nation's economic strength, boasting that poverty was on the verge of disappearing. President Herbert Hoover would even famously declare in 1928 that America was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. It was the kind of bold claim people desperately wanted to believe, and they did. But prosperity built on an illusion can't last. Behind the flashing headlines, corporations were overproducing goods that people couldn't actually afford without going into debt. Personal debt was piling up, inequality was widening, and in Wall Street's soaring numbers, very little of it reflected the real economy. Stocks weren't rising because companies were genuinely worth more. They were rising because people just believed they would keep rising. That's not growth. That's a bubble. And bubbles always burst. The warning signs were there, subtle but unmistakable. A few economists warned that prices couldn't possibly keep climbing forever. A handful of bankers urged caution. But in the fever of the Roaring Twenties, those warnings just sounded like the mutterings of pessimists. Who wanted to listen to bad news when making money seemed so easy? Who wanted to be the first to leave the party when the jazz was still playing, the champagne was still flowing, and fortunes seemed to be made overnight? Think of it this way. America was dancing on the edge of a volcano. The music was loud, the lights were bright, and the crowd was so caught up in the celebration that they didn't notice the ground trembling right beneath their feet. Every single dollar borrowed on margin, every headline proclaiming endless wealth, every skyscraper built on a mountain of debt was just another crack in the ground, another tremor beneath the dance floor. The Roaring Twenties weren't just about style and speed. They were about greed disguised as prosperity, speculation disguised as progress, and illusions masquerading as reality. It was a decade of extraordinary highs, but those highs came with hidden costs. And when the bill for all of it finally came due, it would shake America to its very core. By October 1929, the bubble had grown as large as it could possibly get. The stock market, once seen as a golden ladder to wealth, was now a powder keg just waiting for a spark. When it finally exploded, it wouldn't just bring down bankers and speculators, it would bring down families, farms, and factories. It would turn the roaring jazz into a deafening silence, the laughter into fear, and the roar of the 20s into a desperate whisper of despair. This is where the story of the Great Depression truly begins, not with the crash itself, but with the illusions that made the crash inevitable. The heart of the Roaring '20s wasn't just the glittering streets of New York or the jazz spilling from every speakeasy. It was Wall Street, a mechanical, pulsating theater of power where fortunes were made and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. Imagine standing on the crowded floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1928. Brokers pace back and forth, shouting bids over one another. The room vibrates with energy, a symphony of cash, greed, and ambition. Every whisper, every gesture carries weight. Here, the most powerful men in America play a game that the rest of the country barely understands. A young trader leans over the ticker tape, his eyes wide with anticipation. He mutters, "It can only go up, sir. Invest now or you'll regret it for the rest of your life." His client, a small-town banker who has never set foot in Manhattan before, nods nervously, handing over thousands of dollars he doesn't fully have. Margin buying had made gambling look respectable. Everyone was chasing a dream they didn't fully understand, and every broker knew exactly how to stoke that fire. At the center of it all were the powerhouse banks, giants like J.P. Morgan & Co., National City Bank, and Kuhn, Loeb & Co. These institutions weren't just handling money, they were controlling it. They orchestrated massive deals, created investment trusts, and quietly manipulated markets. Their influence wasn't public knowledge, but the results were unmistakable. Stock prices climbed, mergers happened behind closed doors, and the ordinary American felt the illusion of stability. "Gentlemen, the market is ours to manage. There is no cause for alarm," a senior banker reassures a room of jittery investors. The words are calm, measured, but the tension is electric. Outside the walls of these grand offices, people are still buying on margin, trusting the promises of men whose main goal is to protect their own fortunes. It wasn't only banks that held sway. Industrial titans like John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford had indirect but enormous influence over Wall Street. Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire, once considered untouchable, had shares listed, bonds traded, and vast fortunes flowing through Wall Street corridors. Ford's automotive revolution created an entirely new consumer base, one flush with wages, eager to invest. These titans weren't just building empires, they were setting the stage for a market frenzy, whether they intended to or not. Meanwhile, a network of silent puppeteers worked behind the scenes. Investment trusts, sometimes called pools, gathered millions of dollars from small investors, only to funnel them into speculative trades that benefited the managers. Insider trading was rampant. A select few knew exactly which way the market would swing and acted on that knowledge, while ordinary Americans blindly followed trends. "Don't worry, the top will hold. Everyone's buying. It's too late to turn back now," whispers an insider to a nervous colleague. The colleague swallows hard, realizing that the game isn't fair, that the cards are stacked. But by then, millions have already bet everything. The media played its part, fanning the flames. Newspapers carried headlines like, "Stocks soar to new heights. America enters a new era of wealth." Radio programs repeated the same messages, while financial experts reassured the public that prosperity was permanent. Fear was unpopular. Optimism sold papers. The illusion of endless growth became a collective delusion. Despite warnings from a handful of economists, the illusion persisted. One critic, scribbling in a private journal, wrote, "Prices have no anchor in reality. The market is a house of cards, and it will collapse under its own weight." The words went largely unheard. Greed drowned out reason. At its peak, Wall Street's machine was operating at full speed. Brokers, bankers, and speculators worked in perfect synchrony, manipulating markets while ordinary Americans danced along, unaware of how fragile the system had become. The wealthiest men, the ones pulling the strings, could see the cracks forming. They knew the risks, yet most continued unabated. Their confidence, or arrogance, created the perfect storm. And then there were moments of drama no historian could forget. Outside a crowded office, a small-town investor whispers to his friend, "I've borrowed every penny I own. I hope this works." Moments later, another man throws down his hat in frustration, realizing the stock he bought on margin has already lost half its value. These were the real human consequences of a market manipulated by a handful of powerful men. Even as warnings grew louder, the public remained entranced. The combination of media hype, banking influence, and industrial wealth created an illusion of stability that few dared question. Wall Street had become a stage where power, greed, and spectacle intertwined, leaving the nation dancing on a knife's edge. As 1929 approached, the machine had reached its apex. The brokers were faster, the bankers more secretive, the trust pools larger, and the ordinary investor more oblivious. The game was being played at dizzying heights, and the first spark, a small decline in stock prices, would set off a chain reaction no one could stop. "We're untouchable," one tycoon boasts in a smoky office, oblivious to the storm about to hit. And that's the cruel irony. The same men who built the frenzy would survive, shielded by wealth and influence, while millions of ordinary Americans would pay the price in ways they could never imagine. This was Wall Street's machine at its most dangerous, a relentless engine of power, greed, and illusion. It was a machine that made dreams and shattered them. The stage was set. Black Tuesday was coming, and when it arrived, the world would never look at money, power, or Wall Street the same way again. The morning of October 24th, 1929, would go down in history as Black Thursday, the day the illusion of prosperity began to crumble. The streets outside the New York Stock Exchange were already buzzing, but inside panic had taken hold. Brokers paced frantically, ticker tape machines struggled to keep up, and the air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and fear. Men in fine suits shouted over each other, each trying to sell before someone else did. Every second brought more numbers, more losses, and the growing realization the market could no longer be controlled. A young broker leaned toward his client, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to sell now, or it's gone. I've never seen it like this." The client, pale and trembling, clutched his stock certificates. They represented his life savings, the money he had borrowed, and a lifetime of hope. I can't," he stammered. "If I sell now, I'll lose everything." But the truth was unavoidable. The market had turned, and there would be no mercy. Inside the exchange, veterans of the floor moved like predators in a jungle. They shouted, gestured wildly, and attempted to manage the chaos, but the tide was unstoppable. Panic had taken the reins. Millions of dollars were vanishing in minutes. Brokers who had once exuded confidence now looked haunted, sweat streaking their faces. Outside, the scene was no less dramatic. Thousands of onlookers gathered, craning their necks to catch glimpses of the frantic trading. People whispered to each other, "Did you hear? Stocks are collapsing!" Children peeked from street corners, while parents tried to hide fear behind forced smiles. The energy of Wall Street, always electric, always alive, now felt like a storm about to break. By the afternoon, desperate measures were taken. Some of the most powerful bankers in the country, led by J.P. Morgan, coordinated a massive buy to stabilize the market. "We must show confidence," Morgan told a group of fellow financiers. "If we fail to act, panic will spread like wildfire." For a moment it worked. Stocks steadied. Hope flickered. But it was only temporary. The foundation of greed, speculation, and borrowed money was already cracking beneath them. Then came Black Tuesday, October 29th. The day the floor of the New York Stock Exchange seemed to vanish beneath the feet of every investor. From the moment the opening bell rang, the chaos was total. Brokers screamed. Ticker tape machines spewed numbers faster than anyone could record. Thousands of sell orders poured in while no one wanted to buy. Every share sold pushed prices lower. Every second multiplied the losses. A small-town investor, standing in a brokerage office far from Manhattan, whispered to his friend, "It's all gone. Everything, my farm, my savings, gone." Nearby, a banker yelled at a clerk, "Call the clients! Stop them from selling!" But it was already too late. The panic had become a contagion. Across the country, newspapers reported devastation. Families watched their life savings evaporate, businesses shuttered, and banks began to fail. The wealthiest men, those who had manipulated the market and controlled vast fortunes, moved quickly to protect themselves. Insiders quietly sold their shares before the collapse, leaving the ordinary investor with nothing. The cruelty of the crash was not just financial, it was personal, leaving scars that would last a generation. The psychological impact was immediate. People could not comprehend how quickly fortunes disappeared. Houses, farms, and businesses that had seemed secure now teetered on the edge of ruin. Suicide rates rose, and despair spread like wildfire. The American dream, once bright and promising, now seemed fragile and cruel. Amid the chaos, the lessons of the Roaring Twenties became horrifyingly clear. The greed, the speculation, the illusion of endless prosperity, all had built a mountain on sand. And when the storm hit, there was nowhere for it to go but down. Yet even in that darkness, the story of survival among the elite unfolded. While millions suffered, the few at the top quietly salvaged fortunes, using knowledge, connections, and timing to escape the worst of the devastation. The divide between the powerful and the powerless had never been more stark. By the end of Black Tuesday, the world had changed forever. Wall Street was no longer a place of limitless opportunity. It had become a symbol of risk, greed, and the fragility of wealth. The Great Depression had begun, and its effects would ripple through every corner of America and beyond for a decade. The dust hadn't even settled after Black Tuesday before America faced a harsh new reality. Millions of people awoke to find their savings gone, their businesses shuttered, and their futures uncertain. The Roaring Twenties, with all its jazz, champagne, and roaring engines, had vanished overnight, replaced by a silence thick with despair. Families who once celebrated prosperity now queued for bread. Children went hungry. Factories closed. Streets that once glittered with neon lights were now lined with the weary and desperate. In a small Ohio town, a father returns home from the factory, if it's still open. His wife is sitting at the kitchen table, staring at bills she cannot pay. She looks up at him and says softly, "I don't know how we'll survive this." He slumps into a chair, the weight of helplessness pressing on him. Across the nation, countless households shared this scene, each one a microcosm of the heartbreak that rippled across America. Banks, once the symbols of security and trust, had failed. Depositors lost everything as institutions collapsed under the weight of bad loans and reckless speculation. J.P. Morgan and other elite financiers quietly protected themselves, but ordinary Americans had nowhere to turn. Small towns and rural communities were particularly hard hit. Farmers, who had borrowed heavily during the boom to expand production, saw their crop prices fall, leaving them with mountains of debt and no way to repay it. Yet amid the chaos, stories of resilience emerged. Communities banded together, sharing food, shelter, and hope. Churches opened their doors. Charities organized soup kitchens. The human spirit, tested to its limits, found ways to survive. One woman in Kansas recalls giving half her ration of bread to a neighbor's child, whispering, "We're in this together. We have to keep going." Moments like these, though small, became the backbone of survival during these grim years. Meanwhile, the federal government scrambled to respond. Initially slow to act, President Herbert Hoover's policies were widely criticized as ineffective. Hoover believed in volunteerism and local relief rather than federal intervention, but the scale of the disaster made that approach nearly impossible. Millions remained unemployed. Cities swelled with the homeless, who created shantytowns mockingly called Hoovervilles. The frustration and anger of the populace simmered beneath the surface, waiting for leadership that could restore faith. The tide began to turn with Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932. His promise of a New Deal offered hope, a vision that government could play a role in recovery, that Americans could rebuild from the rubble. Roosevelt's policies introduced relief programs for the unemployed, economic reforms, and public works projects that not only created jobs, but also restored a sense of dignity. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," Roosevelt declared in his inaugural speech. And for millions, those words were more than rhetoric. They were a lifeline. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, and Social Security began to stitch the torn fabric of the nation back together. But recovery was neither immediate nor easy. Farmers continued to struggle with debt and the Dust Bowl, which compounded the crisis. Factories and banks took years to stabilize. Families learned to stretch every penny, grow their own food, and rely on neighbors. And yet, through hardship, America discovered resilience, ingenuity, and a new understanding of the social contract, the idea that government could intervene for the common good when markets failed catastrophically. The era also left a lasting psychological impact. Americans became cautious with investments, skeptical of unchecked capitalism, and more aware of the fragility of wealth. Literature, film, and art from the period reflected this transformation, capturing both despair and hope, suffering and determination. Stories of people overcoming adversity, rebuilding their lives, and finding ways to thrive in the harshest circumstances became a defining narrative of the decade. By the mid-1930s, the worst was over, but the scars of the Great Depression remained. Families rebuilt slowly, but the lessons of the crash lingered. Greed and speculation have consequences. Unchecked power can devastate lives, and resilience is often born from collective struggle. The nation had survived the storm, and the stories of hardship, courage, and recovery became a testament to the human spirit and a warning for future generations. As we reflect on this era, it becomes clear that the Great Depression was more than an economic crisis. It was a test of character, a lesson in humility, and a turning point in the relationship between citizens and the institutions meant to protect them. And while Black Tuesday marked the fall, the recovery that followed demonstrated the indomitable strength of a nation unwilling to surrender to despair. The ashes of the Great Depression still lingered over Wall Street as the 1930s progressed. The crash of 1929 had left its mark not only on the economy, but also on the psyche of every American who had lost everything. The streets that once hummed with energy now carried caution and mistrust. Yet even in ruin, the gears of power were slowly turning, and Wall Street, like a phoenix, was preparing to rise from the debris. Inside the offices of the remaining banks and investment firms, a new awareness began to settle. The market could no longer operate as it had in the 1920s, unchecked and unregulated. Government oversight, once minimal, became not just necessary, but inevitable. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 established the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, a watchdog meant to prevent the kind of insider trading and market manipulation that had led to the catastrophic crash. "We've been blind for too long," said a senior regulator to his team, pacing the room. Now, the market must operate transparently. No more secrets, no more manipulation. The tone was serious. The lessons of Black Tuesday were clear. Investors had demanded fairness, and the government was stepping in to provide it. Meanwhile, Wall Street's power players adapted. Many of the same names who had dominated the Roaring '20s remained influential, but their methods evolved. Riskier speculation became more calculated, investment trusts were restructured. Banks learned to balance greed with caution, knowing that oversight could no longer be ignored. Rockefeller, Morgan, and other elites still controlled enormous wealth, but the rules of the game had shifted. Across the nation, Americans cautiously re-entered the market. The scars of the crash were deep. Families approached investing with skepticism, balancing hope with fear. Brokers learned that persuasion had limits. Confidence had to be rebuilt through transparency and trust. The era of wild, unchecked speculation had ended, replaced by a more disciplined, though still highly competitive, financial landscape. "We must show stability to regain confidence," a broker whispered to a colleague in 1935, pointing at the ticker tape. One misstep, and panic returns. The anxiety on the trading floor was palpable. Lessons had been learned the hard way, and even the most seasoned financiers now tempered ambition with prudence. Beyond regulation, the culture of finance itself was transforming. Investment banks and Wall Street firms expanded into corporate advisory, underwriting, and asset management. The seeds of modern finance were planted. Diversified portfolios, retirement funds, and financial products designed for ordinary Americans. The market was no longer just a playground for the wealthy. It was slowly becoming a system that could support broader participation, though inequality remained a constant backdrop. Yet, human nature persisted. Greed, ambition, and the desire for influence never disappeared. Insider dealings, speculation, and risk-taking continued, but within a framework designed to prevent total collapse. The SEC's rules, combined with lessons learned from the Depression, ensured that Wall Street could never again operate with the same unchecked frenzy that had devastated millions. Culturally, the era left a lasting impression. Films, literature, and newspapers documented both the horrors and the resilience of the people who lived through the crash. Stories of survivors who rebuilt businesses, recovered savings, and reimagined their lives inspired a generation. Wall Street, though scarred, became a symbol not only of risk but also of opportunity, innovation, and recovery. "We rebuild not just the market, but the nation's trust," remarked a banker during a meeting in the late 1930s. "Without confidence, money is meaningless." Confidence, it seemed, was as valuable as gold, the lifeblood of finance, and the thread connecting Americans to the promises of Wall Street. By the end of the decade, Wall Street had transformed. From ruin to rebirth, the market adapted to survive, a machine tempered by regulation, scarred by history, but resilient. The lessons of the crash shaped policies, culture, and the very structure of finance. Ordinary Americans had learned caution, elites had learned prudence, and the financial system had learned to endure. The story of Wall Street's rebirth is more than just economics. It is a tale of adaptation, resilience, and the interplay between power and responsibility. The same streets that had witnessed the chaos of Black Tuesday now hummed with cautious optimism. The machine was alive again, but this time it bore the wisdom of past mistakes. As the 1940s dawned, the United States had endured not only the Great Depression, but also the upheaval of World War II. Wall Street, once the symbol of unchecked speculation, had been reborn as a more disciplined, regulated, and powerful engine of the economy. The streets of New York buzzed with a new energy, a careful optimism rooted in hard lessons learned from the chaos of 1929. Brokers and bankers had adapted, ordinary Americans had regained confidence, and the financial system had found a way to grow stronger without repeating past mistakes. Inside the towering offices of investment banks, men in crisp suits reviewed stock portfolios, advised corporate clients, and planned long-term growth strategies. "We can't forget the crash," whispered a senior partner at Morgan Stanley in 1946. "Every move must balance ambition with caution. One misstep, and history will judge us harshly." Across the room, younger brokers nodded, acutely aware that the past decade's disasters were still fresh in the public consciousness. The post-war boom changed everything. Returning soldiers, armed with education and confidence, entered the workforce and began investing in the stock market, often for the first time. Home ownership surged, fueled by the GI Bill, and consumer spending skyrocketed. The stock market became more than a place for the wealthy. It was increasingly seen as a pathway for the middle class to participate in America's economic miracle. Wall Street's influence expanded beyond mere stock trading. Corporate finance, mergers, acquisitions, and public offerings became sophisticated, multi-layered systems. Investment banks now guided entire industries, shaping companies, economies, and even public policy. The men and women of finance had learned that raw power alone was not enough. Influence required credibility, networks, and foresight. The market is no longer a gamble. It's a mechanism, a senior analyst told his team, pointing to a graph showing steady post-war growth. We must manage risk, advise wisely, and ensure stability. That is how we earn trust. Unlike the frenzy of the 1920s, strategy now trumped speculation. Yet human ambition, that ever-present force, continued to drive innovation, competition, and occasionally, recklessness. Technology began to play a crucial role. Telephones, computers, and later electronic trading systems expanded the speed and reach of Wall Street. Decisions once made in crowded trading floors could now be executed across the country in seconds. The power of finance became not just local but national and eventually global. The lessons of past failures were encoded into regulations, but opportunity and influence remained concentrated among those who understood the mechanisms of money and risk. Meanwhile, the media continued to shape perception. Business sections in newspapers, financial magazines, and radio programs educated, informed, and sometimes misled investors. Transparency had improved since the 1930s, but the allure of wealth, the promise of quick gains, and the prestige of Wall Street still captivated millions. Families who had survived the Depression watched the market carefully, some investing cautiously, others embracing new opportunities with enthusiasm born of necessity and ambition. The psychological scars of the 1929 crash lingered, but so did resilience. Americans became more financially literate, more skeptical of extreme speculation, and yet more eager to seize the new opportunities of a booming post-war economy. Wall Street had evolved into a system where regulation, strategy, and human ambition coexisted, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes dangerously, shaping the modern financial world. By the 1960s, Wall Street's power was unquestioned. Investment culture was now embedded in American life, with mutual funds, retirement accounts, and institutional investors guiding billions of dollars. The legacy of the Great Depression remained a cautionary tale, but it also inspired mechanisms designed to prevent a repeat disaster. Yet the very concentration of wealth and influence raised questions. Could history repeat itself if ambition again outpaced caution? We remember the crash, but we must never forget the possibilities, a prominent banker mused in 1965, gazing at the skyline of New York. This is a place where vision meets risk, where fortune is made, but only if respect for the past guides us. The words echoed the eternal tension of Wall Street, between ambition and prudence, greed and responsibility, innovation and caution. Wall Street had transformed from the wild chaos of the Roaring Twenties through the destruction of the Depression into the sophisticated financial engine of the modern era. Its influence extended far beyond stock prices, shaping industries, economies, and even national policy. The men and women of finance had learned, adapted, and evolved, creating a system that was both resilient and powerful. Yet the lessons of history remained, a reminder that wealth, power, and ambition, if unchecked, could still unleash devastation. The story of Wall Street's rise and rebirth is not merely one of money. It is a story of human ambition, resilience, adaptation, and the ongoing struggle to balance power with responsibility. From the chaos of Black Tuesday to the calculated growth of the post-war era, Wall Street has continually evolved, reflecting the dreams, fears, and ingenuity of the nation it serves. Even as Wall Street flourished in the decades following the Great Depression, its glittering towers concealed shadows of ambition, greed, and corruption. For every story of resilience and recovery, there were whispers of manipulation, risky speculation, and scandals that threatened to shake the public's trust. The financial world, built on power and information, remained fertile ground for those willing to exploit both. In the early 1960s, a group of brokers sat in a smoke-filled office overlooking Wall Street. One leaned back in his chair and whispered to a colleague, "The regulators are asleep. We can move millions before anyone notices." The colleague nodded, a thrill of danger coursing through him. Insider trading, stock manipulation, and market pooling were no longer relics of the 1920s. They had evolved, adapting to a more sophisticated system, and the temptation was irresistible. Corporate scandals emerged across industries. Companies would inflate earnings, hide debts, or manipulate stock prices, often with the complicity of Wall Street banks. Ordinary investors, many of whom had regained confidence after decades of caution, once again faced invisible forces influencing their fate. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Market manipulation alleged in major corporation," warning the public, yet these stories often seemed distant, abstract, or inevitable. "We're just guiding the market," a senior banker reassured a worried client in 1970. "It's for stability, for everyone's benefit." But the line between guidance and exploitation was thin, often crossing into outright deception. The power of influence, combined with inside information, created a system where a few could reap massive rewards while millions risked their life savings unknowingly. One of the most notorious episodes came during the 1980s, a decade marked by aggressive mergers, leveraged buyouts, and Wall Street icons who flaunted wealth and power. Michael Milken, the junk bond king, epitomized both genius and hubris. In office towers buzzing with activity, brokers whispered, "This deal will make us all richer than we dreamed." Behind closed doors, financial engineering pushed companies to their limits, creating short-term profits while masking long-term instability. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans watched the spectacle unfold. TV and newspapers broadcast images of yachts, luxury cars, and headlines about billion-dollar deals, fueling envy, aspiration, and sometimes naivety. The allure of wealth remained magnetic, drawing the public back into the market, often without understanding the risks beneath the surface. Scandals weren't limited to individuals. Entire firms collapsed under the weight of fraud and mismanagement. From insider trading cases to accounting scandals, each episode served as a reminder of the tension between profit and ethics, ambition and responsibility. Regulators responded, laws were passed, but the cycle of temptation, greed, and exposure seemed eternal. History teaches, but humans forget, a financial historian noted in a lecture about the 1990s market bubble. The patterns repeat. Ambition grows, oversight falters, and the system bends under pressure until it breaks. Wall Street was simultaneously stronger and more vulnerable than ever, fortified with rules, yet driven by human desire. The 2000s brought new crises, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial meltdown, and countless smaller scandals, each echoing lessons from the past. The subprime mortgage disaster revealed that the same cycles of risk, speculation, and greed could resurface, devastating millions once again. Brokers, investment banks, rating agencies, and homeowners all played roles, proving that history was never fully learned, only temporarily remembered. Through it all, Wall Street endured, evolved, and adapted. Yet each scandal, each collapse, reinforced a central truth. The financial system is a human creation, and humans remain fallible. Ambition drives innovation, but unchecked ambition can produce ruin. Power concentrates, information flows unevenly, and trust is fragile. The stories of Wall Street's scandals are a cautionary tale and a testament to the enduring tension between risk, reward, and ethics. By the end of the century, the lessons of history coexisted with the promise of modern finance. Wall Street had become a global force, shaping economies, governments, and individual lives. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, the shadows of past greed lingered, a reminder that the machine of finance, no matter how regulated, is only as moral as the people who control it. The skyline of modern Manhattan gleams with glass and steel, a testament to ambition, innovation, and the concentrated power of wealth. Wall Street no longer operates solely through brokers and trading floors. It now pulses through global markets, high-frequency algorithms, and billionaire minds shaping industries that span the world. From Silicon Valley to Wall Street towers, wealth and power converge in ways both visible and invisible, reshaping economies, politics, and society. In a sleek office overlooking the financial district, a young hedge fund manager whispers to his team, "Tech stocks are the new oil. If we move early, we'll control markets no one even sees yet." The words are calculated, precise, a reflection of the modern market. Faster, larger, and more interconnected than anything the world had seen in the 20th century. Algorithms trade millions in milliseconds, billionaires influence legislation, and the stakes have never been higher. The rise of tech billionaires, the Jeff Bezoses, Elon Musks, and Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, has transformed the rules of wealth. Unlike traditional Wall Street magnates, these figures built empires from ideas, code, and platforms. Yet their power overlaps with the financial markets, as stock valuations, venture capital, and IPOs tie innovation directly to Wall Street's pulse. A single tweet, a market rumor, or an announcement can shift billions in seconds, demonstrating the profound influence of both wealth and perception. "We're not just trading stocks," a tech investor explains during a panel discussion. "We're trading influence, attention, and control over entire industries." The statement captures the new era. Finance is now inseparable from media, technology, and politics. The very definition of power has evolved, blurring the lines between banker, entrepreneur, and policymaker. Meanwhile, hedge funds and private equity wield unprecedented influence. They acquire struggling companies, restructure them, and dictate labor decisions, all while enriching shareholders. The consequences ripple far beyond Wall Street, impacting workers, communities, and global supply chains. Ordinary Americans may invest in retirement funds, or ETFs, unaware that their wealth is intertwined with decisions made behind closed doors by billionaires and financiers. Government oversight exists, but regulation struggles to keep pace with the speed and complexity of modern finance. Insider knowledge now includes AI predictions, algorithmic trends, and real-time global data, dimensions unthinkable in the days of ticker tape and margin calls. "The game has changed," a senior SEC official remarks in an interview. "We regulate what we can, but markets move faster than policy." Public perception is equally complex. Media coverage glorifies billionaire lifestyles, emphasizing innovation and vision, yet critiques systemic inequality, corporate lobbying, and tax strategies that concentrate wealth. Social movements challenge the morality of extreme wealth, highlighting the tension between innovation-driven prosperity and social responsibility. Wall Street, tech, and political influence intertwine, creating a web that touches every corner of modern life. The parallels with history are striking. Just as the titans of the 1920s manipulated markets, insiders now navigate global systems with unparalleled resources. The consequences are broader, but the themes are timeless: power, greed, ambition, and influence. Dialogue from the past resonates today. "We're untouchable," a modern financier might whisper privately, echoing the hubris of 1929. Markets bend to those who understand them best. Yet, history warns that concentrated power carries risk to the market, society, and democracy itself. Amid this modern complexity, the ordinary investor still seeks opportunity. Retirement accounts, mutual funds, and ETFs democratize access to wealth, but they also obscure the mechanisms of risk, influence, and speculation. Every market swing, whether a tech IPO surge or a cryptocurrency collapse, reminds Americans that Wall Street's legacy is both opportunity and danger. By the end of the 21st century's first decades, Wall Street has evolved into a global nexus of finance, technology, and politics. Its influence spans industries, governments, and societies, reflecting both human ingenuity and human fallibility. The stories of past crashes, recovery, and scandals echo in modern trading floors, algorithmic strategies, and boardroom discussions. The machine of finance endures, reshaped but relentless, its lessons written in history, yet always subject to repetition. Wall Street in the modern era demonstrates a simple truth. Power and wealth are inseparable from responsibility, yet human ambition often tests those boundaries. From the titans of oil to the giants of technology, the threads of influence, greed, and innovation connect across generations. The story is far from over, and the future of finance will continue to reflect the eternal tension between human aspiration and the fragility of the systems we build. The Great Depression was more than a collapse of numbers on a ticker tape, more than the crash of stocks and the shuttering of banks. It was the breaking of an illusion, the shattering of America's belief in endless prosperity. In the roaring 1920s, the nation had convinced itself that the boom would never end, that speculation was safe, that industry and finance would lift everyone into a golden age. But beneath the glittering facade, the structure was fragile, hollow, and waiting for a single spark to ignite collapse. When the crash came in October of 1929, it was not merely an economic event, it was a psychological one. In the span of days, fortunes disappeared. Banks that had stood as symbols of security locked their doors. Crowds gathered outside Wall Street, their faces etched with disbelief. This was not supposed to happen in America, the land of opportunity, but it did. And once the illusion was broken, panic spread like wildfire. The depression that followed was deep, merciless, and enduring. By 1933, unemployment had soared to nearly 25%. Entire communities were reduced to lines at soup kitchens, men and women clutching tin cups for a ladle of broth and bread. Farms failed by the thousands, their owners watching helplessly as dust storms swallowed their crops and banks reclaimed their land. In cities, families lived in makeshift shanty towns known as Hoovervilles, bitterly named after the president they blamed for their plight. Children scavenged for coal along railroad tracks to heat their homes, while their parents wondered how long the darkness would last. What makes the Great Depression so haunting is not only the suffering it unleashed, but also how avoidable much of it was. The seeds had been planted long before the crash. Unchecked speculation, reckless banking practices, massive inequality, and blind faith in markets that were anything but stable. Regulators looked the other way, politicians cheered the boom, and newspapers reinforced the myth that prosperity was permanent. By the time the warning signs appeared, the machine was already in motion, impossible to stop. And yet, amid the devastation, the Great Depression transformed America. It forced the nation to confront the dangers of unregulated capitalism, to see that markets left to themselves could devour entire societies. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal redefined the role of government, introducing safeguards that still exist today: Social Security, bank deposit insurance, stricter financial oversight. These reforms did not end suffering overnight, but they planted the seeds of resilience, ensuring that America would never again be left so defenseless against financial disaster. Still, the Depression's scars never truly healed. It redefined a generation. Men who once dreamed of wealth grew cautious, forever haunted by the memory of sudden ruin. Families clung to thrift, stretching every dollar, distrusting promises of easy prosperity. And the political consequences rippled across the globe. In Europe, The economic turmoil helped fuel the rise of fascism, plunging the world into the deadliest war in history. The Great Depression was not confined to Wall Street or America. It was a global crisis, a reminder that when financial systems collapse, the shockwaves can reshape the destiny of nations. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Depression was how invisible the suffering often was to those at the top. While millions went hungry, while children shivered in the cold, while entire towns withered away, many of the financiers who had fueled the frenzy emerged battered but intact. For the wealthy elite, the Depression was a setback. For ordinary Americans, it was a life sentence. The inequality that existed before the crash became unbearable in its aftermath, and faith in the fairness of the system was shattered. And yet, from the depths of despair came resilience. America did not disappear. It endured. Farmers replanted, workers sought new trades, families supported one another through unimaginable hardship. Out of the rubble of Wall Street's collapse came not only anger, but also innovation, reform, and a new understanding of community. The Depression was proof of both the fragility of human systems and the strength of the human spirit. But the most important lesson of the Great Depression is that history does not stay buried. Its shadows linger. We saw echoes of it in 2008, when reckless lending and unchecked greed triggered another financial crisis. We see echoes today in speculative bubbles, in growing inequality, in the blind faith that technology and markets will always self-correct. The lesson of the Great Depression is that prosperity built on illusions will always crumble, and when it does, it is the many who pay the price for the mistakes of the few. The Great Depression is often remembered as a single chapter of history, bound between 1929 and the early 1940s. But in truth, it is an ongoing warning. It whispers to us through time, reminding us that unchecked greed, unregulated systems, and blind optimism can destroy even the most powerful nation. And it challenges us to ask, when the next great crash comes, will we recognize it for what it is? Or will we once again convince ourselves that the good times will never end? The conclusion of the Great Depression is not closure, but caution. It remains a mirror we cannot look away from. A reminder that wealth and ruin, hope and despair, light and shadow are forever entwined. And as long as markets exist, the specter of the Depression will remain, not as a relic, but as a warning.